Well, I've got great news for everybody. Apparently, the Russia-Ukraine war is coming to an end very soon. As President Volodymyr Zelensky this morning in his the Parliament, the Rada, laid out finally his victory plan. He finally went public with it. We've been talking a lot about it. And pretty soon now that it's as simple as can be, the war is going to be over. He sent out a 5-point plan. Yeah, of course, that's all fiction. And it's not connected to reality at all. And in fact, it's a new level of fiction, and it's frankly very bizarre and puzzling to me. And we're going to go through exactly why that is and what he said, how it is not even connected to reality, and then we're going to show you what the reality actually is. And to unfold this today, we have back in the show today Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran, and just great analyst on these kinds of situations. First of all, Doug, just welcome back to the show.
Sure. Hi, Dan.
Wow. Listen, this is really strange to me, I got to say. And that's saying something, because we've talked so many times about how Zelensky is just kind of in another planet, and how many of the things that he says are just kind of crazy. But this one just reaches a new level because of the context with which these comments are made. One of the first ones he's talking about, as Gary showing on that headline there, is he's pointing to the growing apparent role of North Korea in the war, not just in providing ammunition and artillery pieces, shells, which they've done a lot of, allegedly somewhere between 3 and 4 million. There's some missiles and who knows what other kind of support. A lot of this stuff is kind of secret, but there's been large numbers of it. Now, all of a sudden, there's some reports from the South Korean intelligence agencies that that North Korean troops are fighting along with Russia in some of the areas of the front already. Thousands more could be on the way. First of all, I just want to talk to you about that aspect of it. How significant is this, if the reports are true, that North Korean troops are actually participating with Russia?
I don't think it's very significant. And if there are any Korean troops on the ground, as it's being explained to me by my sources, they tend to be combat engineers who have played a role in the fortifications. And much of this has been done really to pacify Kim in North Korea. Kim has been falling all over himself to ingratiate himself with Putin and Russia. Remember, for all intents and purposes, Russia is his mentor, sponsor, lifeline, not China. People just don't understand what Northeast Asia is all about. The Chinese don't like the North Koreans. North Koreans do not like the Chinese, but the North Koreans recognize that Xi is the emperor, and you can't get sideways with the emperor. So that's why when the emperor told Xi told Kim to go to Hanoi and sign the denuclearization agreement with Trump, he went and was prepared to do that because that's what Xi told him to do. Now what we have is a longtime friend in Russia and Moscow has supplied them with food when they've needed it, which has been pretty frequent, frankly, given all the famines, and a lot of other raw materials that from time to time they've needed, and technology for all of their rocketry, missile technology is all from Russia. And, North Korea is kind of a useful guard dog. If you want to distract America, if you want to remind the United States that you're capable of escalating conflict horizontally, in other words, not just in one theater, but in multiple theaters, you bring in the Korean dog and the dog barks. But, beyond that, no, there's not much there. And I don't think there are any combat troops. And frankly, this is part of this mythology that the Russians need foreigners to come in and fight for them. They do not. They've been turning away recruits to the army. There are more people volunteering than they can take. It's just not true. So I don't think it's significant in that sense at all.
Right. That's actually what I was about to ask, what you just did about whether the Russians need combat troops on the ground. I suppose you could say that especially if they are highly trained engineers, I could see where that could be a force multiplier for the Russians. But in terms of just, mass conscripts, I guess no one's even talked about that yet. And apparently, as you're saying, Russia doesn't even need it.
Well, Dan, before you leave this, remember that the Russians, who've stripped away all of the air and missile defense in Ukraine, are sending these aircraft in with so-called glide bombs. And some of these have been 6,900, 9,000-pound fuel air explosive bombs. Now, I don't know that your audience knows what fuel air explosive means, but you do. And I've never seen it in action, but I know it was used in Vietnam. And it's frightening. You're talking about, a couple of square miles literally leveled within a space of a couple of seconds when the detonation occurs and sucks all the oxygen within 2 square miles out of the atmosphere and kills everything within that blast radius. They've been using that to finish off Ukrainian forces in some last fortifications in the Donbass and elsewhere. This war is over, and the Russians don't need any troops to make it over. It's over. All the Ukrainians are doing is dying. That's it.
Right, and that's one of the and Gary, I'm glad you found this video here of Tourette's in particular. We'll be looking at that here momentarily on the map here and what. But those images there are just haunting. That this basically a ghost town that's just in rubble and continuing on. But that issue that you raised, Doug, about the fact that Russia is advancing all across the front there and just killing Ukrainians left and right. That's the context with which these comments were made by Zelensky this morning. First, I want to show you what he said, that his peace plan is actually all about global peace. He's going to bring this plan that's going to bring peace all over the world. Watch this.
Якщо війна Росії проти України завершиться на саміті миру та на основі міжнародного права, це переконає інших потенційних агресорів не розв'язувати інші війни. І якщо ж Путін досягне своїх божевільних цілей геополітичних, військових, ідеологічних, економічних, то це створить нездоланне враження у інших потенційних агресорів, зокрема в регіоні і Затоки, в Індо-Тихоокеанському регіоні, в Африці, що загарбницькі війни можуть бути вигідними і для них також.
Okay, first of all, I just want to look at just the concept of what he's talking about. Is there any connection between what happens in Russia, Ukraine, and what happens in conflicts anywhere else in the world?
I think there is some connectivity to the Middle East insofar as the Russians are standing by Iran and supporting them and providing them with technology, missiles, technical advice from thousands of Russian soldiers, military professionals, including pilots. So I guess you could make that connection. Zelensky and Netanyahu are both very similar in the sense that neither is confronting reality strategically at this point. But beyond that, I don't know what else to say.
Well, it just seems odd that he's, consistent that he's trying to make the case that if somehow this weaker Ukraine can force Russia into some sort of negotiated settlement, that all these other warlords around the world will look and say, I guess we just shouldn't go or shouldn't take action. But these kinds of conflicts in human history are always based on the local conditions and the interest of the various players and what they think they are and what they think they can get. And they could care less what happens to a large extent elsewhere. Is that close to being right?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. I think you're right. Let's just stop for a second and understand what we're dealing with. This is the clown who used to try and play a piano with his genitalia. This is not a serious political figure. This is not some great geostrategic strategist or anything else. And secondly, he's known to use a lot of cocaine. And I think maybe some of that is intruding into his political life. I wouldn't take anything this man says seriously at all, under any circumstances. He's effectively been on the outs and hung out to dry now for over a year. He is raking in large quantities of cash that he and his supporters are squirreling away in various bank accounts. He is really consigning Ukraine to death, and he's doing it gleefully because he's enriching himself in the process. And people keep telling me, well, Doug, why don't some Ukrainian generals step forward and tell us that, what the truth is, and why don't they throw off this man's influence? because they're all on the take. They're all being paid. This is a giant charade. It has been from the beginning, but now it's turned into a tragedy on a scale that I don't think any of us have seen in decades.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, the level of destruction is just catastrophic. The next level of fiction that he talked about here is not just that their success means peace for all the world, but that they're going to take their place as a leading European power. Watch this.
Для України це, безперечно, бути сильною частиною глобального світу, бути на рівних з усіма країнами-лідерами, бути в Євросоюзі та в НАТО, бути там повноправно, бути там – це справедливо для нас. Слава Україні!
Okay, prior to the Russian war, before there was any conflict, Ukraine was the poorest nation in Europe and the most corrupt. So by what kind of fantasy can anyone say that after this catastrophic destruction and the loss of millions of its people, both dead and abroad, that they're going to become an equal footing with the likes of Germany and UK and France and some of those others? That just seems to me maybe to be the most disjointed.
It's complete nonsense. I mean, he might as well stand up there and tell everyone that Santa Claus died in the same car wreck that killed the Good Fairy and Smokey the Snowman or whatever. This is absurd nonsense. Frosty, rather. It's not Smokey.
Right.
This is all absurd nonsense. This is pure theater. He has orders to maintain the facade that there is a real Ukrainian state with a real economy, a real armed force, and a real government until after the election. That's his job. He's got to keep this up until the election is over. Then everyone in Washington is going to say, well, we did all we could, and wash their hands of this fiasco. But right now, it's as though you're sitting at the dinner table in Washington, D.C., and you have this sort of steaming pile of excrement in the middle of the dinner table. Everybody knows what it is and wants to remove it, but nobody is willing to be the first person to stand up and say, let's get rid of this. So they're going to let it sit there until after the election. And at the same time, they have a new pile growing at the other end of the dinner table in the Middle East.
Yeah, we'll get to that shortly. The next thing here, if that was the most crazy thing that you've heard, there was actually one a little bit more crazy. There's actually two, so we're gonna build up to this one, but the next one is really quite striking because he says, and in context, before I show you this, let's remind everybody that the entirety of 2023, Russia spent primarily on the defensive, and Ukraine spent around 6 to 9 months preparing for an offensive that was crushed and broke its teeth on the first of 5 lines of defense, never even made it past that. And in light of that and all of the losses they've suffered in the 12 months since that time, Zelensky says he's going to force Russia into peace.
Ми, українці, разом з нашими партнерами, ми повинні змінити обставини так, щоб війна закінчилась безвідносно до того, що хоче Путін. Ми всі повинні змінити обставини так, щоб Росія була примушена до миру. Якщо почати рухатися цією ідеєю, з цим конкретним планом перемоги саме зараз, то може вдатися завершити війну не пізніше, ніж наступного року.
Now, you may think that just based on that one clip there, well, he must mean a negotiated settlement next year. But he, elsewhere in that speech, rejected any possibility of trading land for peace. No terrain back to the 1991 borders will be given to Russia. So the only thing he can mean there is he's going to win a war. I mean, given what they've already failed and the losses in the 12 consecutive months since, I don't get it, Doug.
Well, he's obviously been conferring with his military advisors, General Petraeus, General Cavoli, General Keane, who knows, General Hodges, and they're prompting him to say these things. At the same time, he's talking to the people that are bankrolling him, people at the top of the CIA and MI6, people in London and Washington, and they're saying, have at it. keep it up to the last possible moment. It's hard for Americans right now to understand how completely misinformed they are and how little truth they've been told over the last 3 years. It's tragic, Dan, but that's where we are.
And here is the cream of the crop. Zelensky's laid out this plan, right? He's talked about the things that they're going to do and how he's going to force Russia. And now then here he's going to explain how he's going to do that. Now, as he gets to a key moment, the camera's going to pin over to their commander of their armed forces, General Syrski, and watch his face and tell me if you think that he agrees with what's being said.
Перший пункт – це запрошення в НАТО. Зараз. Другий пункт – оборона. Це незворотнє зміцнення української оборони проти агресора. Це реалістично захищати наші позиції на полі бою в Україні і водночас обов'язково повертати війну на територію Росії.
So his plan is we're going to join NATO right now and invade Russia, and everything's going to work out fine. That is the most delusional thing that I think he has ever said.
You notice that everyone stood up and clapped. They're well paid. They too have benefited from the largesse of our billions pumped into Ukraine. And I suspect that Syrski is probably saying to himself, am I going to be able to get out of here before all of this collapses? Is the escape route set up? Am I going to fly, drive, float, whatever out of the area? I think a lot of people are probably saying that to themselves quietly right now. That's where we are. It's a fact. This thing is over. But as I pointed out, they want to keep this rolling until the election is over. Then they'll wash their hands of it, just as we washed our hands of Saigon and South Vietnam. We'll do the same thing here.
Yeah, I think so. And I just wonder, though, how people, even in public, even in the media, can take any of this seriously at all. For example, aside from all those things I just showed you, the Ukrainian's UN ambassador made a tweet afterwards to amplify some of the things he said. And they said that, hey, it's not such a bad idea. She said, sorry. That inviting Ukraine into NATO, that would remove the main bone of contention between Kiev and Moscow and make them quit fighting. And I'm like, the exact opposite is the truth. Russia has said from the outset that it was NATO into Ukraine which prompted the war. Jens Stoltenberg publicly admitted that Putin told them that if you take NATO off the table, there doesn't have to be a war, but if it is on there will be fighting. And we rejected it, etc. By what any kind of twisted logic can they say now that would take it off the table? And how can anyone in the West put any serious stock behind that?
There is a scene in the film Downfall, Untergang, with the great Bruno Ganz, who gives, I think, a pretty good performance as Hitler in April 1945. And as he's about to go into his private apartments, shoot his girlfriend and himself through the head, one of the women in the hallway, who's some sort of assistant or stenographer, says, "But mein Führer, what about the final victory? And Gültiger Sieg, the final victory, what about it?" He just looks at her, gives her a dirty look, goes to the door, shuts the door, and the rest is history. I think you're going to have that kind of reaction in large parts of Europe and the United States when it happens. That's the tragedy. People are actually going to say, my God, what happened? How could this be? I don't know what you can do about it, but the truth will eventually come out. And when the truth comes out, there's going to be hell to pay. I think the truth is actually seeping out today in France, in Germany, even in Great Britain, which is probably the worst when it comes to suppressing the truth through its media and government than the rest, I'm sorry to say.
Well, that's a pretty high standard to meet if they're gonna be even worse than we are, because there was a comment by Secretary of State Blinken last week about Russia. And if anybody's thinking about any kind of a negotiated settlement of any kind, we don't seem to even be talking. Watch this exchange.
With regard to Minister Lavrov, no, we didn't speak directly, but I was in the room when he made his intervention on behalf of Russia. He was in the room when I made my intervention on behalf of the United States. So I think it's safe to say that we heard each other. I didn't hear anything new, unfortunately, about the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's striking that so many countries that are half a world away in the Indo-Pacific care deeply about what's going on in Ukraine. And the reason, again, is because they know that if any country is allowed to act with impunity and to commit acts of aggression, that's a signal to would-be aggressors everywhere that it's open season. And that's going to be bad for everyone. So, again, I listened to him. Can't speak to whether he listened to me, but I didn't hear anything new.
So, I mean, that was almost a version of some of these things I just showed you from Zelensky himself. That's also disconnected from reality. But yet this is the chief diplomat of the United States of America. This is the guy who's supposed to be leading negotiations. And yet he's talking passively like, I don't know, I didn't talk to him. I mean, what kind of future and hope do we have when that's our senior diplomat?
Well, as long as this administration is in power, none. We can write it off. Let's understand something, and I think I may have mentioned this previously, or perhaps I haven't, but a close friend of mine who just a few months ago went around to many of the major capitals of the Middle East, finishing up the journey in Cairo, and spent extensive time with members of General Sisi's cabinet in Egypt. And the complaint that this person heard repeatedly was, we're all tired of hearing Mr. Netanyahu's talking points from Mr. Blinken. Right now, we, the United States of America, are viewed by the rest of the world, particularly in the Middle East and Europe, but elsewhere, as effectively the poodle of Israel. We are the sort of obedient dog who is doing exactly what Mr. Netanyahu tells us to do. So I don't think anyone thinks at the moment in the Kremlin that Blinken really represents anything other than Netanyahu's views of the world. And that aligns with Zelensky. Zelensky is equally delusional, and he's under orders to remain delusional and will be paid handsomely for his work right up and through the election that's coming. It's a tragedy. We look ridiculous. Now, Lavrov, in particular, is someone who is much closer to what you would have seen in Tsarist Russia before World War I. We had a number of very competent ministers, despite some bad decisions that tragically the Tsar made, who gave the Tsar excellent advice and actually steered Russian foreign policy in good directions. He's very much in that mode. His command of English is flawless. He understands everyone's interests. He probably understands our interests better than we do, because we don't seem to pursue our own interests, because there's nothing that would drive us to confront Russia in eastern Ukraine over eastern Ukraine. Nothing. No strategic interest whatsoever. So he knows what he's dealing with, and there's no point in him talking to Mr. Blinken.
Well, yeah, and he is making some statements, and ironically, they're still offering. This is from a week or so back, where he said that Russia is still open to a political diplomatic settlement. And of course, that's one of the frustrations that I have, that our side isn't even talking, because they say they want to end the conflict, not just have a ceasefire. And then he lays out what it is, which is echoing what President Putin had said in June this past summer. But we're not going to be following any of that. You see that it has to abandon the quest to become NATO, which has been, even before the war, has always been the central pillar, but we haven't. So in the meantime, even though Lavrov is offering and Putin are offering a path out diplomatically, they're pursuing a path out militarily. And here is a chart that recently was published, I think just a couple of days ago, which shows that in the gray area on the lower bar there is all the territory that Russia seized from Ukraine in the full year of 2023, which is 140 9 or something like that square kilometers. And it's a relatively small number because they spent nearly the whole year on defense. It wasn't until the latter couple of months that they started moving up. But now then you see that throughout this year, and especially going back to June, July, August, and September, there's an increasing and accelerating capture of Ukrainian territory. And I think more importantly than this, the number of square kilometers is the number of Ukrainian troops that are paying the ultimate sacrifice. And I think that might be the bigger issue. But this is the reality on the battlefield, is that Ukraine is losing physical territory and they're losing troops. Can they even maintain their defensive positions to even have any kind of a hope for negotiated settlement?
Max Hastings wrote a book about the last 9 months of World War II, focusing primarily on Europe. And that's when most of Germany's casualties were taken. Casualties were not taken before the collapse. They were taken once the collapse began. And that collapse began really soon after Normandy. You couldn't replace the people that you were losing. You couldn't replace many things. You could build new equipment, but there wasn't really anybody out there to use it. And you put it in the hands of people who weren't that well trained. This has been the case in Ukraine for some time now. I hope that your viewing audience will remember that these retired 4-stars and 3-stars like Petraeus and Hodges and others kept insisting month after month, week after week, day after day, that the Ukrainians had mastered, quote unquote, combined arms tactics. Combined arms tactics are World War II tactics. We're not fighting World War II. We came to this battle, and I'm talking about us as well as the Ukrainians, completely ill-equipped to fight the Russians. The Russians have moved dramatically and decisively into the 21st century. And they have created this ISR strike complex and built their ground force to operate within it. We don't understand it. I think some of us do, but we don't really understand that this changes war, and it's all afforded by precision technology, digitization, and missiles and hypersonics. All of these things combine to radically change warfare. We are living in the mid-20th century. We've lost touch. We are so far behind in our thinking that we can no longer catch up. We are prepared to fight not just the last war, but a war from 50 years ago. We have a few new toys, new technologies sprinkled in amongst the force, but the force is anachronistic. And the senior officers who run it, their thinking is mired in the past, and they're not taking account of what has changed. I remember General Wes Clark, who said, let's just give the Ukrainians 500 M1A1 tanks and they'll just drive over the Russians.
I remember that.
Incomprehensible. I mean, it's an expression of complete failure to understand just how profoundly warfare has changed. That should have been very, very obvious after the first 12 months, but it still isn't. But now we have to ask, how do we hold these people accountable for the terrible tragedy that they have created? When I say they, I'm talking about people in Washington, London, not just in Kyiv, all over, who have egged these Ukrainians on to do stupid things, which have gotten them into very serious trouble. I don't know.
And Doug, if it was only limited to the battlefield and the consequences there, that would be a horrific tragedy, because the human cost, especially to the Ukrainian people, is just unimaginable. And I think it'll be some time before all the truth comes out about how bad the casualties and the destruction has really been. But this extends beyond just what happens in Ukraine. In fact, you can actually argue that this war is also in a diplomatic realm that's also going against us. And you talk about focused on the past, like the way the Americans have been operating economically ever since the end of the Second World War. And we've been dominating in that regard, especially with the G7, et cetera. But there's a meeting in BRICS coming up about a week from now where things are decidedly not going in the direction of us. And in fact, because part of our pressure against Russia, again, some things in the Middle East, and also a lot of the economic pressure we're putting on China, as bringing all of these people together, not just militarily, but also economically. And this, Gary, if you can put that headline back up there again, part of this BRICS meeting that's coming up there is that Russia is going to push to end the dollar dominance. And I just wonder if you could talk a minute about the significance of that, because I think some people don't really understand how significant that could be.
No, I think this is the world's rejection of American financial, political, and military hegemony. They're sick of us because we have bullied people all over the world for decades. It was not enough that they did business in dollars, which allowed us to pass our debt on to them, obviously. It was not enough that we dominated the institutions, things like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. We always wanted more. We wanted obedience. An alliance with the United States did not mean we're in a mutual defense agreement. You'll help me, I'll help you in dire circumstances. It was, you are now a vassal state of Greater America, which really means Greater Washington, because most Americans are not even aware of the status quo in the world that existed that provided them, frankly, with a very high standard of living. BRICS is unstoppable. There are about 84 countries lined up to join it. Turkey is now going to this BRICS summit that you mentioned. There will be others there as observers. This is the future. The future is not armed conflict at this point. This is something that I don't think Americans understand. You know, sometimes I talk about the bombs away club, Dan. You know, these are the people in the bleachers that as soon as you drop a bomb on someone somewhere in the world, they all stand up and say, "Oh, hooray, we're bombing X number of people that can't fight back. This expresses our greatness to the world." It doesn't. It hasn't worked. It's been a catastrophe since 1965. We need to stop it. We need to understand that the instrumentalities that we built and used to assert ourselves and our dominance are no longer useful. In fact, if anything, they're self-defeating. BRICS is going to build a new currency system in the sense that they will do business probably in denominations that are backed by gold, potentially other commodities. It'll sort itself out over the next few years. This is not going to happen overnight because the institutions that we have evolved over many decades. But we're not going to stop it. And I've already heard people say, well, we need to punish anyone who is not trading in dollars. What a disaster. All that does is reinforce larger failure. We have got to adapt. We've got to realize the world has changed. Our instrumentalities are no longer relevant. We've got to get out of the business of bullying and bombing. Bullying and bombing. That's got to go away. I don't know how we do it without a clean sweep in Washington. Because if you've lived in a world where you think you are the center of the universe, or were the center of the universe for decades, and now you're being told, you know, there's a big world out there. The universe is much larger today. Yeah. We have nations that are coming back to life that used to bestride the world as great powers, from China, from Beijing to Tehran, all the way to South America. The world has changed. We need to change with it, but we don't want to. And the great danger is that by refusing to do so, eventually what you see happening in BRICS will become militarized against us. I think that's happening right now against Israel and the United States. It's very dangerous.
Indeed it is. In fact, I want to shift gears real quick to the Middle East. There's been lots of debate going on about why after the October 1st missile strike from Iran into Israel, there wasn't an immediate response, because Benjamin Netanyahu came on that same night and actually vowed a authoritative response. There's been many officials afterwards that said the same thing. And I believe it was yesterday, maybe the day before yesterday, Yoav Gallant came back on and said, no, seriously, there's going to be one and it's coming soon. Here's what he said a few days before that.
You saw the strikes that Iran launched against us a short time ago. Those strikes were aggressive, but they failed because they weren't accurate. Just as we have been doing until now in the war on all other fronts, whoever attacks us will be hurt and will pay a price. Our attack will be deadly, precise, and above all, surprising. They will not understand what happened or how it happened. They will see the results.
Now, I've shown in previous episodes here in this space a number of high ranking or high visibility American officials that are agreeing with that they should strike Iran, that they should decapitate General Kellogg. In fact, said, yeah, they should take out the Ayatollah, and somehow that would make things better. General Keane said the same kinds of things, that, yeah, they definitely need to go after the head of the snake. Naftali Bennett has just been going on almost a campaign on the Western media saying, yes, we should go and take the whole thing out because that's the problem for the entire Middle East, et cetera. But I wonder, Doug, if you can talk about the complexity that's involved here, because it's not just going about Iran. Iran provides 1.5 million barrels a day of oil to China, so they would not take kindly to losing that possibility. And Russia depends upon a lot of the military support from Iran. So both of those two nuclear powers have an incentive for this not to happen. What do you think the results would be if Israel strikes anyway?
Well, first of all, I don't know that Mr. Netanyahu in his current position has much choice. Let's look at the facts on the ground. Now, people in Israel do not have a complete picture, despite the fact this is a small country. A lot of people know each other as a result and have sons, daughters, and so forth in the armed forces. When you watch Israeli television, it's quite surprising. They think that the world is their oyster, if you will, and they are the pearl. They seem to think that they can pretty much do whatever. When questioned about the fact that Hamas is still existent, they say, well, it's damaged. Sure, it's damaged, but you set out to annihilate it. And it's recovered pretty dramatically. It has no trouble at all with recruits. What about Hezbollah? Well, we've done a lot of damage to Hezbollah. How far have you gotten into southern Lebanon? What, 1,000 meters, if that? Maybe a little longer? Well, what are you going to do about it? Well, we don't necessarily have to drive all the way to the Litani River. Oh, really? Then what's your plan to annihilate Hezbollah? Well, we think we have time to go back and deal with these problems. We need to bomb Iran. We have to go and destroy Iran. That's the real problem. That's the head of the snake, as you said. That's where people are thinking. And there is no sense whatsoever that the last attack of 180 missiles was actually remarkably accurate. And they were able to hit very significant and sensitive targets. They did not set out to kill large numbers of people. That was by design. The Israelis, on one hand, at the top, I think, recognize they're dealing with a much more formidable enemy than they thought. But on the other hand, they also think, I fear, that the Iranians are feeble, weak, and will essentially take the beating. You know, this is old thinking that goes back into the 70s or the 60s. Those things have changed. Those nations in the region are different now. The people that live there are different. I still don't think that's sunk in, but here's the key thing to keep in mind. The last play and the most important play that Mr. Netanyahu has is to bring us into the war on Israel's behalf against Iran. Now, if you sit down privately with anybody in the White House right now, I think they will confide in you and say, we really don't want a war with Iran. I know that in the Department of Defense, the attitude at the highest levels is we really don't want a war with Iran. They understand what that means. The consequences, as you pointed out earlier, for the global economy, for our own economy, for the financial system, and also for the region, and the potential for bringing Russia into the equation. Remember, the Russians have thousands of people on the ground in Iran right now. They've built up the air and missile defense apparatus as rapidly and effectively as they can, but they've also flooded lots of other technologies into the country, particularly missiles and weapons. So Iran is ready in a way that it has probably never been to deal with this Israeli attack.
And Doug, let me ask you,
will not exercise any restraint after Israel attacks them. That's over, because I'm sure you saw in the news that someone in the State Department apparently leaked some very critical information about discussions we had with the Iranians. What a disaster. The Iranians have now said, that's it. No more. We're not playing your game. We will act decisively. So I think the table is set for a tragedy, a big tragedy.
Yeah, and I had not seen that what you were referring to there yet, but I assumed that was the case because they have shown so much restraint. I mean, going back to when their embassy was bombed and their assassination, in their capital city during an inauguration, and they were remarkably restrained. I think because they didn't want a wider war and they wanted to try and prevent that if they could. But if there's any more, I think that they probably have reached the end of their patience. But I wonder, in the last bit of time we have here, if you can talk about the military task and difficulty facing Israel. What could be an attainable military objective or a political objective if they use military power? Because given the size and the limitations of the Israeli armed forces in total, and the distance between them and Iran, and the difficulty with air or missile strength. What could Israel even do? Because unless you invade a country, you can't defeat it militarily. You can hurt it. But then if they can't defeat it, then what's the end state?
Israel knows that it cannot subjugate Iran on its own. That's why we are there. Israel cannot succeed in removing what it considers to be its most existential threat in the region without American military participation. Now, we've got roughly 1,000 fighters ready to go. We've got many, many missile systems primed and ready. But of course, the magazines are full, but they're not easy to replenish.
Right.
We don't have limitless supplies of missiles, but we've got quite a bit over there. And the assumption is that between the bombers and the missiles and our command of space with ISR strike or ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, that we can provide Israel with a war-winning, game-winning outcome. I'm not sure that's true because, again, the Russians are involved. They're not going to allow Iran to be pulverized. And I've always said, and anybody who understands great power politics understands this, if you set out to destroy a nation the size of Iran, and it's a large country, what are there, 90 million people in it? Yeah. Iran is probably the size in terms of square mileage of Western Europe. Now, they have two vast deserts inside the country and lots of mountain ranges, which have protected them for many years. So their population is concentrated in several cities. There's no question about that. But the notion that you can destroy or annihilate this place is a very dangerous assumption. First of all, Russia's not going to permit it. Let me be very clear on that. The Russians have said so. They will not allow Iran to be destroyed. Two, if we try to destroy it, it's going to redound to our disadvantage. If you remove Persia, Iran, this power, from the equation, who becomes powerful in the region? Israel? Not if it is being flattened by missiles. Not the United States that is now pariah in the region. No one believes us. No one trusts us. Everyone sees us as the poodle, that does what it's told by Israel. Well, Turkey is the primary beneficiary. The Turks will rise and become the dominant power. And ultimately, that's far more frightening, in my judgment, to the Israelis and potentially to Europe in some respects, depending upon what happens, than almost anything else I can think of. Because in contrast to Iran, that has no ground force to speak of, it's not marching any armies up to the Golan Heights. The Turks have substantial armies that they can field. They have substantial air forces and substantial naval power. Whereas Iran is primarily relied on its proxies and its missiles. So I don't see a good outcome here, and that's been my concern from the beginning for Israel. How does Israel benefit from this? How do they come out and go on? Because remember, they've also announced repeatedly to everyone who cared to listen that their neighbors are Amalek. And you say, well, they were only talking about the people in Gaza. Ask people in Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, what they think the Israelis meant. What a catastrophe. You have to live in a region and interact with the people that are there, and you've told them that they are subhuman animals that deserve the worst.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, definitely that's the case, and because especially when they further see action that, they're bombing the Houthis in Yemen, they're attacking now into Lebanon, looking to push way up beyond even the Litani River, according to where they've given orders for people to evacuate from. Now they're looking to go into Iran, and people have to wonder, are we next? And whether they are or not, it's a valid question to even ask. And so you see that there's a lot of trouble here, and even if we look for the United States ourselves, I mean, we've got a lot of vulnerability there. We just put this STAD or ordered this STAD system in there, and apparently it's going to be in place in some number of days with 100 Americans on the ground, 100 American uniforms. I assume there's also some contractors that will have to go along with that. And then all of these troops we have in Iraq and Syria spread out all over the place, all vulnerable to Iran should we get into a war with them.
Well, we don't go anywhere now without contractors, right, Dan? We know that. That's the American military, unfortunately. Some of it's unavoidable. There were contractors aboard the HMS Hood that sailed out to meet the Bismarck in 1939-40. So I think, it's impossible to go to war without contractors. But having said that, the bottom line is none of this makes any sense from a strategic standpoint. Not if you want Israel to survive. The first rule of all strategy is preserve your country, preserve its strength and its power. And this business of relying almost entirely on the expected intervention of American military power to rescue you or to exploit success and turn that success over to you, literally, I don't think is realistic.
Yeah, I don't either. In fact, I think that if anything, that this could you just further weaken our nation and put at greater risk our national security, because you pointed out, you hit the nail on the head a second ago. Yeah, our magazines are filled right now, and the weapons are loaded and cocked and all that. But we don't have that many to fight a war with in our own inventory, and our industrial capacity is not designed to be able to get into a sustained war anywhere, much less, if it's in multiple places. And, you got to suggest that if we do get it sucked into a war here and all of a sudden we start running low on ammunition, I mean, what's that going to do to Ukraine, number one? And is it going to actually cause other people to take more risk than they could because they see that we now don't have the capacity? That's part of the strategic risk for our country of doing the politically convenient thing of not holding Israel accountable for what they're doing here that I see.
Well, I don't know that it's a matter of convenience. It's just a fact of life.
Well, when I say convenience, I mean that it's like the administration doesn't want to risk upsetting the Israeli lobby and the Israeli voters ahead of this election coming up. So they're taking the easy path by not doing anything in our interest, I think.
Well, I think you're right that the administration wants to stay in power, and therefore they're not going to do anything to interrupt that. And it's really the money involved, not votes. Although I think you have Christians, evangelical Christians, who are certainly part of the voting bloc that you're referring to. The thing is, and this is what upsets me the most, 6 million Jews paid the ultimate price during the Second World War. And that was the down payment on Israel. Suddenly, 70 plus years later, everything is being put at risk. One throw of the dice is what you're talking about when Israel strikes Iran. That's it. That throw has got to be a winner. That's gambling. That's gambling with your country's existence. I think it's a bad idea. It's better to think in terms of multiple throws under different conditions, but I don't think they have multiple throws anymore. That's the point.
Yeah, that is the point. That is the risk for us all. And we'll continue to watch and see what happens with there. I mean, a response could come any day, could come later, could come after the election. Who knows? But we're going to continue to track this. And as always, we're very grateful for your observations and your historical knowledge, especially. Thank you for coming on, Doug.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Bye-bye.
And thank you guys for coming and joining with us today. Also, we're going to have Larry Johnson on today at 2:00. And he's going to be going into a little bit more detail on this so-called victory plan And who's he kidding? And Larry Johnson, as only he can do, will be on with us at 2. So be sure and like and subscribe if you hadn't. Share with your friends so that they can join in with us too. And we will see you at 2 o'clock on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.